Good afternoon. I'm Carrie Watkins, President and CEO of the Oklahoma City National Memorial and Museum. Thank you for joining us as we ask ourselves, 1 year later, does America still enjoy free speech? Over the holidays, I saw a segment on the Today Show that featured Bishop Michael Curry of the Episcopal Church. Some may remember that he joined us for the 25th anniversary ceremony. Let's take a look at a small part of that timely message.
Do you know on the Great Seal of the United States, E pluribus unum, the eagle, and there was a debate about whether it would be a turkey or an eagle, but I'm glad they went with the eagle. But anyway, but E pluribus unum, from many one.
Yeah.
If you look where that comes from, it comes from the writings of Cicero. Cicero in the Roman Republic wrote, and listen to this language, when people learn to love others as much as they love themselves, E pluribus unum becomes possible. Wow. The United States of America becomes possible as E pluribus unum if we do exactly what we're talking about right now.
As you can imagine, we find those words very powerful, and a seal with those exact words was salvaged from the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building after the bombing and is now on display in our museum. The words E pluribus unum have stood the test of time. As Bishop Curry shared, those words are not asking us all to agree, rather they're asking us to love one another, to respect one another, to understand that from many come one. That's the purpose of today's Better Conversation session, to understand that we can all have a difference in opinion, yet maintain respect for one another, always trying to find common ground on this sacred ground. As we participate in today's conversation, we must stand against all violence. I'm reminded, John, that you and I attended a peaceful protest in Oklahoma City Memorial Day weekend 2020. Then later that night, it turned violent. We stood on the memorial grounds nearly helpless as we were impacted by an act of violence. We denounced it then, and we have on every act of violence as a means of impacting government change. Violence in Oklahoma City, Seattle, Portland, your city, Washington, D.C. is all violence. Violence isn't only from those on the far right or the far left. Violence is violence. The unrest of our streets in this country over the past 2 years is not acceptable. We must always recognize that violence is never the solution. Rather, we must work together to find common ground on the memorial's sacred ground. I'm pleased to be joined in the studio today by John Kennedy, our new chairman of the Board of Trustees. Also in studio today are panelists who I consider great constitutionalists. Robert Henry, retired United States Appeals Court judge, and our friend Mike Turpin, former trustee and former Attorney General for Oklahoma.
Thank you, Carrie. And we thank those who are part of today's virtual audience. Many are joining us by Zoom or on Facebook, and we look forward to your participation. This Better Conversation session is a tough one, but an important one. 1 year ago, our country witnessed an insurrection on the United States Capitol. As we look back and think forward, we are reminded of the words written in the memorial mission statement more than 20 years ago. We can never stop instilling an understanding of the senselessness of violence, especially as a means of affecting government change. Those powerful words, written in our mission statement in the days following the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995, now 27 years ago, are as meaningful today as they were then.
It's a powerful reminder that our community and stakeholders were raw from trying to put their own lives back together following what remains the worst domestic terrorist attack on American soil. Those powerful words were written as part of a larger memorial mission statement that would guide the building and today guides the programs of what we know as the Oklahoma City National Memorial and Museum. As we continue with today's conversation, we ask you keep the compelling words in mind as they relate to the events of January 6th.
Today, as we look back 1 year ago, we will never forget people who may have just been going to protest and practice their First Amendment rights of free speech. Today we ask the question, when was the law broken and what marked that moment of insurrection? And how did that impact what we hold so important, the right to free speech, even to those with whom we don't see eye to eye? How do we find common ground? How do we bring people around the table or to the virtual table like we are doing today so that we can come together and have better conversations?
We started Better Conversations nearly 2 years ago. That was before COVID was a household name, before we even knew who George Floyd was, or before so many acts of unrest and hate were happening. All of this demonstrates that we need better conversations now more than ever. We thought there was no better place to find common ground than on the sacred ground of the memorial. I think it's important we remind ourselves and recommit to the better conversations grounding virtues that we also ask everyone to practice during today's session. These grounding virtues come from Krista Tippett's On Being Project, a Peabody Award-winning public radio show and podcast.
These grounding virtues are not just for today. They should be practiced every day as we commit to better conversations within our families, with our friends, and with colleagues at work. Words matter. It's the first grounding virtue. As we discuss today's topic and in your conversations with others moving forward, please use words that shape how we will understand ourselves and each other. Be mindful of how you interpret the words and how you treat each other.
Better conversations can happen when we will all practice humility. Humility is about curiosity, surprise, and delight. Humility is not about being small, it's about encouraging others to be big.
Generous listening, that's the next grounding virtue. Listening is more than just being quiet while others have their say. It's about presence as much as listening. It's about making a connection more than observing. To connect, however, we must listen.
Hospitality is the bridge to all great virtues. You don't have to love or forgive or feel compassion. Those sometimes take time. Yet you can always offer hospitality.
In our conversations, we must practice patience. Transformation takes time, always longer than we'd like. A long, patient view of time will replenish our sense of our capacities and our hope for the future.
And adventurous civility is our final grounding virtue. In our world of constant change, it's about creating new possibilities for living forward while being different and even continuing to hold profound disagreement.
I think it's also important that we mention that today's Better Conversations is not a political discussion. It's not a right or left discussion, or even about right or wrong. It's about gaining a better understanding. We ask our panelists and our viewing audience to buy in on those grounding virtues. And when we say buy in, we mean that we commit to practicing these grounding virtues of words matter, humility, generous listening, hospitality, patience, and adventurous civility during today's Better Conversations and moving forward. If we have your buy-in, panelists and those joining virtually, will you please signal that you agree by raising your hand?
Okay.
Excellent. Thank you. Before I ask our first question to our panelists, we encourage our viewing audience to type your questions into the chat, and we'll get to as many of those questions as possible. I'd like to ask the first question to retired Judge Robert Henry, also former retired Attorney General of Oklahoma, Dean of the Law School at Oklahoma City University, and President of Oklahoma City University, and State Legislator. I had to get all that in because you've done so much in your life. Judge Henry, the Constitution protects the good and the bad. Remind us of the role of our country's guiding document.
Well, John, we only have one Constitution. We don't have a Constitution for good people and a Constitution for bad people. We have one Constitution, and it stands in light of the rule of law. None of us can be free unless all of us follow the rule of law. That's what that Constitution seeks to teach us. And it's worthwhile to remember, just forgive me, I just want to read the preamble one more time. We, the people of the United States, in order to have a more perfect union, to establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. This Constitution has lasted longer than any other. It's produced the oldest form of government in the world, the oldest form of liberty in the world. And it's worthy of respect, of consideration, of understanding. And that's what the memorial is all about, to remind us of this document and what it means and what it stands for.
Thank you.
Mike, like so many of us, you watched this happen on live television a year ago. From your perspective, when do you believe the events of January 6th went from free speech to the point of insurrection?
I've thought about that a lot, and I believe when I saw U.S. senators and congressmen running for their lives, all of a sudden, a protester became an insurrectionist. I didn't say all the protesters, but some protesters became insurrectionists at that point in time when they're pursuing U.S. senators and congressmen. When I saw the Capitol Police beaten, tased, and crushed, I feel like a protester became an insurrectionist at that point in time. When I heard the crowd yell, "Hang Mike Pence, hang Mike Pence, hang Mike Pence," the Vice President of the United States of America, I felt like we'd crossed that line between free speech and, frankly, anarchy, to answer your question directly. And I also believe, you guys covered this in the opening remarks, what happened in Washington, D.C. a year ago, all the perpetrators should be held accountable, and they are, one by one. What happened in the streets of Portland, Oregon, those perpetrators should be held accountable. I believe that. What happened 27 years ago in Oklahoma City with the bombing of the Murrah Federal Building, those perpetrators should be and have been held accountable. So across the board, political acts of violence, we must make sure they're prosecuted to the full extent of the law, the perpetrators. And I happen to believe philosophically the roof of the law covers us all. The roof of the law covers us all. It protects all of us, but it also applies to all of us, including presidents of the United States of America, wherever that may take us.
Thank you, Mike. We'd like you both to answer this question, and we'll start with Judge Henry. Where are we today? 750 arrests, lots of finger pointing. How do we get to common ground when so many can't even respect differences of opinion?
Well, it's a little difficult to know exactly where we are today. There's been a number of hearings, but not too many public hearings. There have been some witnesses testify, but more witnesses are needed. I think the first thing we need to know is exactly what happened. Like Mike said, some of the people were not insurrectionists and may have come for just an exercise of their First Amendment rights. Others had other things in mind. Weapons were utilized. Plans were utilized. So it's difficult to know exactly where we are. I think we have a lot of questions that still need to be answered, and we have a lot of discussions like this one that need to be held. People need to come together and talk. And that's, the memorial is not a fleeting idea. I think it was Churchill who said, first we build our buildings, and then our buildings build us. And that's the memorial. We built the memorial, and now it builds us. Common ground on sacred ground, you said. We need to find that common ground, and the sacred ground is a good place to go to try to find it. And the memorial has opened up all its resources to address this problem that we're talking about today. And there are lots of programs and events and resources that are available for people to help us find out exactly where we are today.
Mike, where do you think we are today as it relates to January 6th? How do you think we find common ground?
I happen to believe that everybody is entitled to their own opinion, obviously. It's part of the greatness of America, not to mention the First Amendment protects that right. But people are not entitled to their own facts. I'm thinking of the TV show Dragnet, just the facts. And if we go back to the last election, the facts are that the former president's chief of cybersecurity said it was the most secure election in American history. The facts are that the former president's Attorney General, Bill Barr, was asked by the former president to ferret out election fraud all over the country. He used the best law enforcement agency on the planet, the FBI, to go find election fraud. He went to every U.S. attorney in America, including right here in Oklahoma City, to go find election fraud. Bill Barr, the Attorney General of the former president, reported back to him, "I cannot find any significant election fraud." Then you look at the courts. The United States Supreme Court, a third of which is appointed by the former president, said again and again and again, we find no fraud, no significant fraud in any way, shape, or form. Well, those are the facts, folks. We don't need to argue about that. Those are facts. And now, fast forward to January 6th. I only brought one quote with me about January 6th from Mitch McConnell. But recently, a local paper said, here's the 10 best quotes of the year. And the first quote is, "The voters, the courts, and the states have all spoken." U.S. Senator Mitch McConnell on the floor of the U.S. Senate on January 6th. So he spoke about, a Republican leader spoke about what I just said, that everybody has resolved that the election was accurate, fair, and that the new president of the United States of America is Joe Biden. That's a Republican saying that. And that day, that night, what happened was the former president thought his last chance to overturn the election was to do what they did, was to storm the nation's capital and try to overturn the election by changing the votes of all the congressmen and all the U.S. senators. It did not work. Where are we today? I think everybody is coming to grips with that. I think slowly but surely we're coming to grips with that. I just quoted Mitch McConnell. And wherever I can, I'm going to quote my Republican friends, because I think that's where we got to be to resolve where we are right now. Reach across the aisle. We've got to have friendships across the aisle in this country. And Mitch McConnell said last week that he appreciates the work of the January 6th commission. He said just last week that I'm watching them closely, and what happened on January 6th a year ago was horrendous, and I'm glad this committee is doing the fact-finding work that they're doing. So it's ongoing, but when you got Republican leaders like Mitch McConnell saying, I want to see the outcome of this investigation, I think it's a good sign for America.
I remember watching live television on what was happening at the United States Capitol and texting my own kids who are in high school and college and just saying, violence isn't normal. Don't ever think this is normal or acceptable. You know, don't ever get comfortable with what you're watching on television today. And we have to find better ways to resolve our differences, which is why we're also offering a special session this afternoon for teens and college students where they will participate in the same Better Conversation session like we are now. I want to share a recent poll that came out after the new year. An overwhelming majority, 72% of Americans believe that people involved in the attack on the United States Capitol were threatening our democracy, while 1 in 4 Americans believe that the individuals involved were protecting our democracy. So my question to you both is, how did we get to this point? And how do some think the events of January 6th were acceptable, while others call it an insurrection? Judge Henry, you want to take that first?
How did we get to this point? It's been a long time in coming, but a lack of civility, a lack of reaching across the aisle, as Mike said, a lack of bipartisanship has caused us to have people that disagree as radically as you've pointed out. Some people saying this supports democracy, others saying this is a grave danger to our democracy. So it's been a while in coming, and it's going to take us a while to get it back. Mm-hmm. It's going to take a lot of effort, like you're doing at the memorial, and like people of goodwill are doing, like Mitch McConnell. It's going to take all of us trying to focus on, as Mike said, just the facts.
Yeah,
ma'am, just the facts. Let us know what the facts are. And how do those facts impact you? I read an article that, Carrie, that you sent me about teachers and how teachers will confront this. Teachers have all sorts of controversy now, from COVID on down. And one teacher, her plan was to show as many videos and representations of things that occurred as possible, and let the students write about them. Let them, what do they see? If this isn't an insurrection, what is it? That has to happen, and it will happen. It'll take a while, but it will happen.
You want to add to that, Mike?
Just that my premise in life has been that personal contact alters opinions. Personal contact alters opinions. We've all got to be friends. We're all in this thing together. And I don't want to get spiritual, but my pastor says every Sunday, hold fast to what is good. Hold fast to what is good. And what is good about this country, this great country, the best country in world history, I think. And we're only 245 years old. We're still a very young experiment in democracy. 245 years, that's 3 times my mother's age, my wonderful mother when she died. We're still a young experiment in democracy. We've learned that we've got to communicate. We've got to get along with each other as best as possible. So personal contact alters opinions. That means people that don't agree with each other necessarily on this issue and every issue, we've got to come together in forums like this and have meaningful dialogue. Oklahoma City, 27 years ago, we like to say that after the bombing, we turned our darkest hour into our finest hour. Now, what do we mean by that? And I'll answer my own question. And we all came together, regardless of philosophy and opinion. We came together, and we came together so well. A renaissance. We rebuilt the city. You know, maps 1, 2, 3, 4 has happened since then. And I think a lot of it we call the Oklahoma Standard, you know, because we all pulled together, came together for the right reasons. And so if the Oklahoma Standard some way could be the American standard for the United States Congress right now, for our leaders in Washington, D.C. as they work through this very hard issue, January 6th, and what we're going to do about it going forward, I wish they could look to Oklahoma City, where we've learned that violence is never the answer. Violence is never the answer. We bring school kids from all over the country, sometimes all over the world, to our memorial, and they all learned that lesson. Violence is never the answer. So that's the ultimate, result I think we got to get to, is work through all this and agree, regardless of political philosophy, not political violence. No political violence, please.
Sometimes people insist that they are right, and if you don't agree with them, you are wrong, or your view is automatically canceled. As we start this new year, what do we need to do to bring people together? Mike?
I can't help but quote JFK. President Kennedy once said that we all have a lot of things in common. And he said, we all inhabit this same small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future. And indeed, we're all mortal. I mean, there are certain common elements, qualities, bonds that bring us all together. And I think we need to focus on that. And I know you're going to have a panel this evening, this afternoon, with the younger people. And I'm a former history major. My son taught history at Westminster School. And so read history. And one of the things you'll learn in history, because I read a lot about Churchill, Robert, you mentioned him a while ago, during the pandemic, I read every World War II book I could. 75 million people died during World War II. 75 million people died during World War II. 400,000 Americans, trying to extricate this planet from the stranglehold of Adolf Hitler. Now, if we can win battles like that, surely we can put January 6th and all the battles we're fighting here in America, whatever the issue may be, in some perspective and work through it in the name of our wonderful democracy.
Judge Henry?
Well, I think this is a little bit of a self-serving thing from my former profession, but I think the judiciary has done a good job in this country, from the Supreme Court on down to the lesser courts. Our rule of law is strong, and those people that are going to be tried will be given full rights and given right to counsel. they'll be given all the rights that all Americans have. And I think we can trust our judiciary to be independent and to continue to stand for an American standard. Not perhaps as strong a one as the Oklahoma standard, Mike, but there is an American standard of justice that is very strong. And that needs to be followed. All of these people that were involved in the insurrection or not involved in the insurrection, they all have their rights, and those rights need to be followed carefully, and they will be by our courts. I think we can, as the courts begin to come to resolution, I think we'll know more about exactly what happened, and I think we have some justifiable pleasure in the accomplishment of our system of law.
You know, the late Desmond Tutu had a remarkable outlook on differences. He said, "Differences are not intended to separate or to alienate. We are different precisely in order to realize our need for one another." How do we recognize that differences can bring us together in our everyday life or in our families, in our professional life, even in the political arena, when today we see so many differences in a negative light? Mike?
At this point in my life, and I've lived an extraordinary life, a blessed life, I should say, because of my family and friends, and my friends are right here. Robert and I have been friends forever, John. I mean, care. You're not surprised. I have another obsession, you know, and so my current obsession in my life is the simple idea of the multi-ethnic family of humankind. The multi-ethnic family of humankind. What can we do to all come together? And all of us need all of us. All of us need all of us. And so when I think of Bishop Tutu and him talking about our differences, I want America to do what we can to embrace our differences, to cherish the diversity in our country. Mid-century, this country will become a minority white country. Don't be afraid of that. We need to embrace the reality of our diversity and the richness that it brings. And my good friend Mike Thompson, former Adjutant General of the National Guard, now coming on the board at the Oklahoma City National Memorial Museum, I asked him recently, African-American leader in this community, I asked him, what are we going to do about my comment that the multi-ethnic family of humankind coming together? And his word to me was empathy. Empathy. We've all got to walk a mile in each other's moccasins, you know. We've all got to figure out what makes the other person tick and what's important to them. So a lot of it comes down to what you talked about in the beginning of the show, active listening. Active listening. And Senator Lankford talks about getting people together on Sunday conversations, people different than you, a different ethnic, you know, background, religion, race, come to your home. He said you can't get all the issues on the table until you put your feet under the same table. So we got to more and more of what we're doing right here. But as he says, coming together on boards and agencies, even for Sunday afternoon dinners.
Coach Henry?
Well, Mike, I think you're right on, spot on everything that you've said. Vive la différence. I mean, we have differences, and we need to embrace them. As you point out, we're going to become a minority white country at the middle of this century, if not a little bit before. And let's celebrate that, as you point out. Let's encourage people to come and have their conversation. Let's use this sacred ground to find the common ground. Let's use the memorial and its tremendous number of assets and the goodwill that Carrie, you had more than anyone else have engendered on the part of this memorial for the many years that you have led it with such dignity and grace. That's how we're going to get there, and we will get there.
John, you want to weigh in on that?
I'm just so happy to be in this conversation and being able to listen to Judge Henry and just his thoughtful approach to this, and also to listen to Mike Turpin. And Mike Turpin has a TV show every week, and the purpose of that show is to come together with someone with a different point of view, a different political point of view. And what I learned from that show when I watch it is they have some different political points of view, but their humanity always comes through, and that they find ways to find common ground and to agree. And I think about in Judge Henry's life as an appellate judge of the United States courts, how his reasoned approach and reasonableness to everyone was so important throughout his career.
You know, the USA Today published a lengthy article on December 30th titled "From Oklahoma City to January 6th, How the U.S. Government Failed to Stop the Rise of Domestic Terrorism." Some of you may be shocked to understand or to learn that domestic terrorism is not new to our country. For so long we have focused on international terrorism, but the facts are we have far greater number of domestic terrorism incidents than we do international. To Judge Henry and Mike, you're both uniquely involved in the law and government. Is there a positive path forward, and if so, what is it? And how do so many Americans fit into the solution of reducing domestic terrorism? Sorry.
27 years ago, when the bomb went off in Oklahoma City, and Carrie, you know much more about this than I do, and so do you, Robert, but a man named Merrick Garland came to town and helped with the investigation and helped with the prosecution. That same Merrick Garland is now the Attorney General of the United States of America. So listen to his comments about January 6th. And going forward, he's putting together a strategy to fight domestic terrorism. International terrorism, we'll continue to fight that, but we got to focus more on domestic terrorism as much as possible. And homegrown terrorism, as we call it at the Memorial Museum. And a lot of them are veterans that come back and do what Timothy McVeigh did. That's a special focus we all got to try to understand. And I'm saying we look to Merrick Garland, the current Attorney General of the United States of America, that has this wonderful background with the Memorial Museum all the way back to 27 years ago, for his leadership on what we can do in this country and what we can do specifically at the Memorial Museum, which he's been to countless times, good friends with Kerry Watkins and all of us, what he would like for us to do to help in regards to stopping where we can, how we can, ongoing domestic violence. I have no easy answers. There are no easy answers.
Well, you're right, Mike. There aren't any easy answers. And one of the things we're going to have to do is spend some money and take some time. You know, Carrie, you talked about how serious domestic terrorism is. Well, you know, Oklahoma City was a domestic terrorism case. And we had people that were trying to cash government checks. They were taking their children to a school, to a public daycare center.
Yeah.
We had people that had nothing to do with whatever it was Timothy McVeigh was concerned about. But there was some anti-Semitism there. There was some white supremacy there. Those things still exist in this country. And we have to be willing to sound them out, whether they're in Seattle or Oklahoma City or Washington, D.C. And we're going to have to come forward and admit those things when they happen. And that's what this conversation is dedicated to doing.
Carrie, you mentioned at 5 p.m. today we'll have a special session for teens and college students on this very conversation about January 6th. And are we better off a year later? As parents and professionals connected to the education system, Judge Henry, you are a former college president. Mike, you're the spouse of a public school teacher and a member of the board of the higher education regents. What role can our schools play in helping our youth understand the vital importance of democracy, the threat that has been growing over time in our country. What role can our youth play in protecting democracy for all? Mike, we'll begin with you.
Study history. Study history. My history professor at the University of Tulsa many years ago said history repeats itself because no one was listening the first time around. So it has to keep repeating itself for us to get the lesson. So for the young people, study history, learn from it. I feel good about America's future when I think of the young people in this country. The next generation, I think, has more respect for each other than my generation has. I mean that sincerely. They have more respect for the planet. They have more respect for themselves. Thank goodness, thank God. And the one thing I'd like to say about what you asked me to the young people, just remember to turn to the ballot box and not the bullet box. I mean, what we're talking about here today was people turning to violence instead of the ballot box. And Timothy McVeigh essentially said, love your country but hate your government. That's no answer. So think in terms of being constructive and not destructive, and remembering always as you study American history going forward as well, violence is never the answer.
Thank you,
Want to add
Judge
anything
Henry.
to that?
That's very good, Michael. You can't love your country and hate your government. It simply doesn't work that way. The government is us, we the people. It says the government is under our control. You know, I said we build our buildings like the memorial, and then our buildings build us. One of the things you find on almost all public buildings in America is steps. You know why they have those steps? So that people can come there and be heard and talk and exercise their First Amendment rights. Steps are easier to talk on because you get somebody at the top of the steps and he can be heard, or she can be heard down to the bottom of the steps. We understand that with our buildings. Our buildings are built to foster that communication. Our Congress was built to foster our communication. We need to let that work and let people communicate with each other and try our best to understand people that look at a matter differently than we do.
I think we have a couple questions from our Zoom wall. Bradley, do you have a question?
Yes, thank you for recognizing me. I was wondering, there's supposed to be a distinct wall between this government and religion, how we have made it in our country, but by the evidence displayed on January 6th last year, religion played a major role in what we saw with protesters using radicalized Christian propaganda and radicalized Christian beliefs to carry out and amplify the situation that occurred at the rally, turned it into the insurrection. So my question is, what role should religious institutions play in this recovery as we move forward as a country? Do religious institutions need to take responsibility and try and help move forward? Or is there even a role for them to play? Do we need to move that out of that atmosphere and put it somewhere else? Thank you.
Mike?
I want to yield to Robert Henry on this one. He's very schooled in the various religions in this world.
Well, there definitely is a role for religion, and it's going to play that role. There may be a good role for it and a bad role for it, but religious groups are going to have their say, and they're going to be heard, and we need to try to foster a broad understanding of values, like we've talked about all day today, and Krista Tippett's virtues that are things that we believe in, and but Christ taught the importance of nonviolence, and we got that from Martin Luther King, from Mahatma Gandhi, the importance of nonviolence and how you can, with nonviolent actions, make major change in the world and major change in America. and we can do that. And religions that encourage violence, I wonder if they're true religions.
I think Sarah Sweet has a question.
Very quickly.
One second, Sarah.
Andy Spyropoulos was a professor at your law school. Just read a column by him where he talks about grace. In my church, we talk about grace, gift received at Christ's expense, grace. He suggested, Robert, the concept of political grace. As we work through all these very contentious issues, including January 6th, a little bit of political grace extended to the other side of the aisle as we try to kind of come together with what we're going to do going forward. Go ahead.
Sarah, do you have a question?
I do. So last year when I saw what happened, and I lost my dad in the bombing, for those who are here who don't know. So anytime there's violence that's in the public sphere, it's terrifying to me. And I don't know, maybe I have PTSD or something, but I'm shocked by the number of people who January 6th a year ago, or even, or it seemed to be unaware of it. And so I just wonder how do we talk to those folks and get them to understand the seriousness of and the potential for violence that's out there.
John mentioned earlier that I've been a part of a TV show on Sunday mornings. I wasn't going to bring it up. I'd say go to church, go to your synagogue, don't watch Sunday morning TV. But if you do, you'll see that Burns Hargis and I did the show for 15 years, and Kirk Comforts and I did the show for 10 years. Now I do the show with a young Republican, the third Republican I've had with me on this show, Todd Lamb. And I'm very proud of Todd Lamb on this issue, a Republican leader on this issue of January 6th. He talks, as a Secret Service agent, a former Secret Service agent that he is, he talks directly and candidly to the American people, including his own party, that everyone must be held accountable for what happened on January 6th. That insurrection. The protesters that didn't come there for that, so be it. First Amendment, the judge talked about that. But for the people that came there for the insurrection, to overturn the election, Todd Lamb, another Republican leader, like Mitch McConnell, believes everybody should be held accountable. And I think that's what's got to happen. I think we've got to have more and more leaders on both sides of the aisle come forward and say what happened was wrong, and it was a dark day in American history.
Well, I think it's important to hear a little bit more from our virtual audience. There's a question, I'm trying to paraphrase because she's written several, but at what point is violence against the state acceptable? And here's, I'm paraphrasing because it's long, but we waited 100 years to really learn the story in Tulsa. We see police violence. We've seen it in Oklahoma City. She mentions an incident she witnessed with her own eyes of taking down a protester. What point? What people are frustrated when they don't feel like their voice is being heard, and how do they get heard, and how do we bring people along who feel like the government's so big and it's so overreach that their version's not being heard, and that is where I think we saw a little bit a year ago, and she's listed several incidents here. You want to take that, Mike?
Whoever's asking the question, and anybody else watching, may think it's a cop-out to a certain extent, but I'll believe till the day I die in the power of the ballot box. That's what made this country what it is, the power of one person's right to vote. I mean, we all have that wonderful title, not called senator or representative or what, citizen. You're a citizen of the United States of America, and you have the right to go vote, and you have the right to organize other people to vote for you and with you, whatever the issue may be. Folks, young people this afternoon, study history and watch again and again about how hard different people throughout the history of this country had fought just for the right to vote. So don't squander it and don't belittle it. I mean, that's how you change this country. It's at the ballot box, I truly believe. In some countries, they knock heads, but in America, we count heads. And it matters. It works. I believe it. Robert?
I agree. People, the First Amendment is a remarkable right. And I talked about how our buildings have steps to help us exercise that right. You can be heard, you can call a press conference in this country and be heard on anything. You will be heard. There will be people there that will cover it. And you can make your arguments without resort to violence. The turning to violence always manages to hurt people that are innocent of any kind of misconduct. They're like we saw in the victims here in Oklahoma City. They were innocent of any kind of governmental misconduct, and yet their lives were taken from them and their families were destroyed because one person thought that he needed a more active First Amendment than he deserved and could get. So we have both the ballot box and the First Amendment. And, as you point out, our government's not that old, but it is the oldest. Yeah. It's the oldest that has kept these rights on the forefront. And we have them. Let's not forget them. Let's use them and allow others to use them too. There could have been a great discussion in January 6th. There could have been a great series of meetings. People could have called in advance, could have reserved spaces. Lots of discussion could have been held. There's going to be cameras getting everything, and people take their cell phones and use them if they need to provide us videos that we never used to get before. So there are things, there are tools that we have that are available to us, like the right to meet and be heard.
And every 2 to 4 to 6 years, we have a peaceful revolution at the polling place.
So I would probably tie an answer to this last question back to Sarah's question. Sarah and her family and her father, they were victims of violence. And the way that, one way that she deals with that is she's a member of the board, an active member of the board of the memorial. And she's made a lifelong commitment to nonviolence. And I think when we model those behaviors, when we make a commitment to the mission statement of the memorial, we all do that individually, and collectively, we truly make a difference by making a commitment to oppose violence. And that inspires me. And I think it can inspire all of us. It's that lifelong commitment.
Any other questions from the video wall?
Mm-hmm.
I've got a question here while you guys think of one. And this is a great perspective. Maybe we don't agree with it, but it's a perspective we should discuss. This is from someone who said they went to the library with their dad over 40 years ago to look up the Articles of Confederation, a document that many people, especially in rural areas, believe is the real Constitution. You guys want to talk about that or belabor that at all?
Robert does.
Well, I see it differently. I don't see very many people that think the Articles of Confederation are the real document. I think they saw it as a failure. I mean, we were able to acquire our independence through primarily the work of one person, George Washington. But the Articles of Confederation did not exist to provide the kind of national government that we needed. We had a war over this, the right to secede. There is no right to secede in America. We had a war, resolved that. Lincoln was right. Guess what? Our greatest American president was right.
1865.
Right. I think that's where we are. The Articles of Confederation were an experiment that didn't work. Our Constitution is one that does work and has worked. And I see the issue a little differently than, I appreciate the question, but I see it a little differently.
Right, it's a great perspective, if that's what people see, how do we bring them around to understanding the founding documents and,
Well, as Mike says, you study history
right.
and see why those articles failed. I mean, coming from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution was a huge change. It's a huge change.
Yeah.
And it wouldn't have happened but for George Washington and Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, these incredible founders, and their incredible wives too, by the way. They marshaled the country to come together, and one at a time, we the people of the United States, not we the various states of the United States, but we the people of the United States, all came together and cast unanimous votes one way or the other to adopt this Constitution.
Mike Edmonds, do you have a question?
Thank you, Carrie. In fact, I did have a question. I was interested in the panelist's thoughts about how do we deal with people who participated in the insurrection now gaining this sense of popularity and becoming sort of popular cult figures and stars and gaining their own sort of following. I don't know if you all saw the article. It was either in the Washington Post or the New York Times about the number of participants in January 6th who are now running for office. The participation in government is good, but they're running for office because of a little bit of their gain status of celebrity. So how do you balance that? I just would love to know your thoughts on that.
Mike?
My initial reaction is it's part of the process. It's part of the process. I mean, I love the noise of democracy. I didn't make that up. President Buchanan once said, I love the noise of democracy. That's what I see that as. We're all participating in the same process. We're not fighting World War II again. You heard me talk about that. You heard Robert talk about the Civil War in 1865. We're not fighting that over again. Yes, there were some Confederate flags being held as they marched into the U.S. Capitol on January 6th, but we're not here to fight the Civil War over again, and hopefully no more world wars that I talked about. But I think people, as Robert Henry said earlier, the First Amendment right for some of those people to try to do exactly what they're doing. They've pled guilty. About 700 people have been, charged, I think. 150 have pled guilty. You've seen the numbers. And you're right. Some of these people that have pled guilty are now trying to parlay that into a certain amount of celebrity status. If they could pull that off, so be it. I mean, they got to go get voters back home, 50% plus one vote, to give them the opportunity to be a senator, a representative, a school board member, or whatever. If they can get people to follow them in those kinds of numbers, I'm going to call it, whether I like it or not, part of the process, part of the American experiment in a young country that's only 245 years old. As we go forward, we still got to respect all of the different voices. And I might say that the two pillars of Western civilization that make America, I think, the greatest country in the whole world is the belief that tomorrow can be better than today, and it's our personal moral obligation to make it so. So I think we're all in this to try to make tomorrow better than today. And there's people that do it differently than I would, and that's the best I can say about that. I mean, I got my own ideas of doing that. Others have their ideas. And as long as it doesn't involve violence, political violence, based on a racial basis or any other basis, religious or otherwise. We've talked about all that in this conversation over the last hour. As long as it doesn't involve political violence, I think I can use Robert Henry, the judge's observation about the breadth of the First Amendment. and the right to assemble and the right to speak your piece.
We have a question, and it's a political question, so I don't really want to go there, but it's about Congress, an article in this morning's paper about the different lack of quotes or input from congressional members, and then some that got very political in their comments. But how do we become less political and more American? Something all politicians need to work on because they do represent both sides.
I want you to jump in after this. Carl Albert was a good friend of yours. Carl Albert was a good friend of Robert Henry's. I knew Carl Albert. We called him the Little Giant from Little Dixie. Speaker of the House of the United States of America from right down there in George Knight Country, Pittsburgh County. And when I first ran for office myself, for Attorney General of the state of Oklahoma, time for Turpin time, I went down to see Carl Albert. And I said, how's it changed since you first went up there? He said, when I first went up there to Washington, D.C. as a congressman, he said, we all turned to each other. Across the aisle, Republican, Democrat, we all became friends. Our families hung out together. You know, by the time I left D.C. years later, instead of turning to each other, everybody was just turning to a camera, one camera, just to pontificate back home on that camera. And maybe demagogue a little bit too, just for re-election and all that. Somehow we got to get back to the idea of turning to each other. All of us need all of us. Hold fast to what is good. All of us working together, being together, and not just turning to the camera and demagoguing any issue. Okay, go ahead.
Well, there is a need for bipartisanship. There clearly is. And we used to see that, I think, more in this country than we have recently. But it's going to have to come back because we are going to have to meet in the middle somewhere. And meeting in the middle it can be a messy struggle. Fisher Ames, one of our great early members of Congress, said that a monarchy is like a splendid sailing ship. It leaves port, flags flying in the air, sails to the middle of the harbor, hits a rock, and goes straight to the bottom. He said democracy is not like a clipper ship, it's like a rough-hewn raft of logs. It will never sink, but damn it, your feet are always wet.
Yeah.
There are some messy aspects of democracy, but it won't sink. We need to have faith in that it won't sink, and we need to exercise our rights with that in mind.
And John Hope Franklin, the great African-American historian, his father, Buck Franklin, who was in the Tulsa Race Massacre 100 years ago, I've got to know him a little bit by reading all of his material. He said what he's learned in his life, even trying to reflect on the Tulsa Race Massacre and who did what to whoever, when, and how. He said, I've learned, and it's just stuck with me. And he got it from a philosopher himself. He said, an old Negro philosopher told him, there's your side, there's my side, and there's the right side. Well, who's to figure out what the right side is? And that's back to the Constitution and all of us working together, pulling together, trying to figure out what that right side may be. Because I don't know, you don't know. We're all in this thing together, folks. All of us need all of us.
So one last question, and this is probably more pertinent for this afternoon, but I want you guys to weigh in on this, is the role of social media has changed. Chatter, talk, feedback, input to politicians, about all of us. We've seen finally these Facebook companies or these social media companies begin to put some restrictions on people who are leading misinformation. But one last question today is what role do you think the misinformation is playing in not being able to bring us back to the middle?
Well, I'm not an expert on social media. I'm afraid of it.
That's why I think this afternoon those kids can tackle this too.
But it clearly has its role, and like you say, I've been pleased that some of the companies that run these social media networks have said, look, you can't lie about the pandemic. You can't lie about vaccines. You can't say they're harmful and these sorts of things, and you can't keep experiencing that in these public records. So it's part of that messy process of democracy, and it will be messy, but there's going to be a lot of social media intervening in this issue and every other issue of our time.
Mike?
I just read where social media is to hate what oxygen is to fire. Unfortunately, the platforms can be used to promote hatred as opposed to lifting us up on issues that we all need to work together on. But we'll work through it. I mean, we can do a whole nother panel on social media. So I'll stop right there. And just the people that administer all the different platforms think in terms of humane technology and not hurtful technology.
Right, go back to the grounding virtues. Well, unfortunately, we were out of time today, but thank you all for joining us and taking part in these better conversations through the teaching of museum exhibits, online educational programs, ongoing discussions, and the memorial sacred ground. We are relentless to find the common ground. Our Better Conversation series will continue throughout the year. Mark your calendar for March 26th for History is Relevant program, where we'll study Abraham Lincoln.
I hope you'll also find time to visit the memorial and museum in this coming year. Check the website for the many programs offered, including America's Best Marathon, the 2022 Run to Remember. If you have not participated as a runner or volunteer, it will be an experience like no other.
For those of you who may be pondering a New Year's resolution, be resolute in practicing those grounding virtues that will help lead a better conversations and a better understanding of one another. There is no better time to start that than right now, January 6th. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, guys.